Gary's going to start out by showing some of his photographs, and then we'll bounce off that, and then afterwards take questions.
So a lot of this is fairly self-explanatory. These are all in chronological order. So this was about an hour after we landed in El Fasher, and I'm not quite sure who these guys are. It's very unclear whether these are Janjaweed or Sudanese military. These days they're all mixed up. They wear the same uniforms and they drive around in the same vehicles. So this is something that was just grabbed out of the side of the window of the car. There's a series of pictures now of two women who were raped. Rod, do you want to talk about them? You interviewed them. Do you want to explain who they were and the circumstances of that, rape as a tool? Whatever?
Yeah, I mean, it got to the point where, we interviewed so many rape victims that we just got to the point where we said, oh no, we can't do another one. It's pretty much the same story everywhere. These women are from the Kasab camp, and their village, they had arrived in this camp after several weeks of trekking with donkeys through the bush. Their village had been sacked and burned by Janjaweed and the military. And going back to that earlier picture of Gary's, I mean, it really doesn't matter whether they're military or Janjaweed. The two are so intertwined in the conflict. Janjaweed wear military uniforms. Military units act like Janjaweed, and for the most part, the Janjaweed are, if not actually part of the military, working in close cooperation with them. These women describes Janjaweed from a neighboring village, from an Arab village that was near, or an Arab camp that was near their village, and taking part in the sacking and burning of their own village, but in cooperation with soldiers and military vehicles, using military hardware, and even supported by helicopters who were resupplying them while they massacred civilians, and then took women out and took them off, and in their cases took them to their own village where they were raped repeatedly by some of the men in the village. Some of them, it's a village nearby, so they actually knew a lot of the perpetrators, and even named several of them for us, and we sort of dutifully took down their names and recorded them for what that was worth.
Okay. So this we had some problems in Al Fasher with the secret police who wouldn't let us travel on a World Food Program helicopter. If you're moving around Darfur, you can't move very far, basically, and there are really only two ways to go. One is with the UN, well, there are commercial flights in and out, but one is with the UN and the other is with the AU, and we were thrown off or not allowed to board the World Food Program flight, so we then made another plan. Maybe, Rod, you can discuss that. We moved with the African Union, and these are some guys up in Khartoum. This is the South African contingent of the African Union, who I thought did a pretty good job, actually.
Well, just to put it in context for those that don't know, I mean, all of Darfur now is a no-go area for land transport for any kind of foreigners or NGOs, journalists, anybody official. The only land traffic is either indigenous traffic, and not much of that, or big armed convoys. And so everybody moves by either helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft. There are a lot of airports. And on our first day in Darfur, we landed in El Fasher. Everywhere you go, you need to present documents and permissions to show that you have the approval to be there. And every encounter with authorities is an opportunity for them to harass you and hassle you. And there's a lot of that goes on. We literally landed in our first hour, and there was some punctuation mark missing on our papers, and they put us off the WFP flight, and I think probably figuring that meant that we were cobbled. We couldn't really do anything except stay in Al Fasher, which is kind of the capital of Darfur. It's the capital technically of North Darfur, but it's the major. It's the head of the African Union peacekeepers, and it's kind of the major focus point. And we did manage to get out by other means, but we basically spent the next 2 weeks hiding out from the authorities and moving around, in ways that would bring as little attention on ourselves as possible, and so we could maximize the amount of time that we could actually work there.
So these are some rebels, signatories to the peace agreement, who having a meeting with the African Union.
Gary.
Sorry. Yeah. Here, one of the things the African Union do, the women are very, very vulnerable. The internally displaced people, the IDPs, are very, very vulnerable. So they've all left their villages, or many of them have left their villages. They're in these camps that don't actually function so well. Maybe Rod can talk about that a little later, because a lot of the NGOs have left the camps. So one of the things the African Union do is escort women who go to the market from the camp. They escort them there, escort them back, and women who go off collecting firewood, because this is when the women get raped, when they leave. I mean, some of them get raped in the camps, but generally it's when they leave the camp. The men stay inside the camps and the women leave them. So this was a donkey patrol, which I thought, at the time they said, Newsweek decided to crash the story after we'd been there, I think, a day and a half, and which is always a bit disappointing.
It was 3 days. But
well, a day and a half of photography. One day was spent under a tree trying to resolve our logistics. So the African Union said, we have this donkey patrol. I thought, oh, God, how interesting is that going to be? But actually, it was pretty interesting. So they have a...
Yeah, my daughter made this picture, her desktop picture on her Mac, and she loved it so much. It also, aside from these women are coming from one refugee camp that's about 15 kilometers from Khartoum town, and they come every morning and return every evening 15 kilometers each way, which is a fair distance on a donkey. And they can't even go that distance. They're coming to the town so they can go to the market and do their shopping. And they can't even go that distance without the risk of being predated upon by the Janjaweed in the area. So the African Union goes along with them, but while they're present, they're relatively safe. Although, if one of them happened to straggle behind or get separated from the group or something, quite likely they'd be attacked. And on these patrols, on these patrols, they're quite frequently picked off, and what usually happens is they're raped and sometimes murdered as well. Although usually they tend to rape women because it's actually much more effective to rape women than to kill them, because you rape her and you set up these kind of this ripple effect of problems that go right through their family and their extended family and their clan, because there's all the shame involved and everything else, and they're kind of a living reminder to everybody who's in charge, the Janjaweed, the Arabs who run the country.
There's just another photograph of the same scene. Here's just water distribution early in the morning in one of the camps, I forget which, but again up in Khartoum. Rod actually saw this, as he often does. He's always tapping me on the shoulder and telling me to shift my ass and get out of the car and take a picture. So
yeah, it's not bad for a 15-second grab shot.
Yeah.
This was a grab shot too, actually.
Yeah, this was quite a scene. Rod and I were a little bit apart photographing this. This is a firewood collection. And these women had just seen the Janjaweed come over the horizon on camels, quite some way away. But Rod and I were both struck independently. This was very much like being on a safari and watching predators coming close to a herd of wildebeest. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, or the reaction of the women. They were terrified.
Yeah. Well, to back up a bit, to give a little context, some of you probably know this, but maybe others don't. That something like at least 2 million and maybe 2.5 million of the people in Darfur, the indigenous African tribals in Darfur, who are most of the people there, 2.5 million of them are in refugee camps, or technically internally displaced people camps. Out of some 6 million people, which is an astonishing number, particularly because most of the others, or a large part of the others, are those people who are in large cities or towns, and the result, the remaining people still living a rural life in their villages and in the bush, it's a very small portion. Everywhere you go, you see burned out villages. And they're in these camps. They're surrounded by government authorities. Sometimes the government authorities come into the camps. Nearby are Janjaweed, Arab nomads, sometimes indigenous to the area, more often not. People who have come into the area to take advantage of the pickings there and the large scale presence of possible prey. And so these camps are guarded technically by the African Union, and they're serviced to some extent by NGOs and humanitarian organizations. But they're completely surrounded by hostiles, and in order to cook, they need to collect firewood, traditionally something that men do, but in this case, men would be killed if they went out of the camp, so women go out instead, and because the worst that'll happen to them is that they're raped usually, and they go out and collect firewood, and they also collect grass fodder for their donkeys, and come back in, and the African Union typically has 2 or 3 days a week where they set up and they escort these women out. But in order to find, you can see what the terrain is like. It's brush, it's semi-arid, almost desert in some places. So they have to range pretty far to find the fodder and to find the firewood. And when they do that, they sometimes get separated from their escorts. And in those cases, the Janjaweed ride down on them or increasingly they drive down on them. Not so much on camels and horses now as in cars. In this case, we were with this group of women who were out collecting firewood, and some Janjaweed on camels appeared on the horizon and started heading toward the group, and the women all scattered and started running, and it did strike both of us who have been on safaris in Kenya and Tanzania. It struck this kind of very kind of primal note, where you have a herd of animals who gather together for protection, and predators who try to pick off the weaker ones or those who stray from the safety of the crowd. And it was very much like this. The women all gathered together, and it was a horrifying image that when you think that these are people, not animals, and we saw that repeated again and again. And one of the things that heightens that impression is that the Africans from Darfur are typically ride donkeys or use donkeys for their transport. The Arabs use camels and horses, and they're much fewer in number, but they have the support of the government, and they have the weapons and everything else, and it kind of. And I think from their point of view too, they see themselves as sort of the lions of the bush, and the Africans as just a lower form of life to take advantage of, and to rape and pillage and otherwise destroy.
Sorry for the technical problems here. I've got no idea what's going on. This is a village. This is south of Khartoum. This is an African village that had been abandoned, and people were living in a camp very, very close by. Actually, I think just a couple of kilometers. And the trees have all been cut for firewood here. There's an African Union soldier from South Africa. So here the African Union little outpost is just on the right. So the villagers leave all their livestock very close to the African Union, presumably so they don't get stolen during the night, because the Janjaweed and the Sudanese army come into the camp and steal and take what they want.
Because the African Union, which does, I think Gary's right to an extent that they do a pretty good job considering, and they get a pretty bad rap, but they're also constrained by a lot of limits put on their mission, and one of the limits is they're not allowed to go out after dark, 6 p.m., and they all have to go back in their camps. So, of course, nothing happens during the daytime; it all happens at night, and at night, in these huge camps, some of them, more than 100,000 people, Janjaweed and government soldiers can wander into the camp at will at night and do pretty much anything they want.
So now there's another abandoned settlement on the road out of Khartoum. This young boy we interviewed, which camp was this? Kasab? Do you remember?
Yes, this was Kasab in Khartoum. Yeah.
Yes, his parents had been killed. Was this the boy whose parents had been killed by a bomb? I forget. We interviewed 3 children here. There are 3 girls here, 4 children.
Yeah, his parents had been killed they went to the mosque in the village to worship, and the mosque was attacked by John Jaweed, who shot up everybody in it. He's in a kind of interesting program that the International Rescue Committee runs in the camp. Well, they sort of run it because now they hardly ever have foreigners working there, so they have some local staff. But it still limps along, and it's a program where they have people that they call animators, and they're local Darfur refugees also, who they've trained to work with children, especially who've lost their families and have been suffered the ravages of war. And they work with the kids to basically make them happy and kind of liven their lives up and teach them a few things, but tell them stories and so on. And this boy goes to one of these animation centers, they call it, he was a very touching kid. Actually, his whole goal in life is to go to Khartoum because it's the only city he's ever heard of. And like most of the kids in this group, it was interesting. Even the animators, these women mostly women who sit and talk with the kids and give them kind of folk counseling. Even the animators themselves had never seen television. They'd heard radio a bit, but the kids even didn't know what television was. And this boy's goal in life was to go to Khartoum and see what the big city was like.
These are some of the animators here. And this was a meeting that Rod had with some of the village elders. They were talking about some of the things, the concerns they have, because the camps have ostensibly, not entirely, but being abandoned by certainly the foreign staff of the NGOs. And only local staff remain, but the local staff, of course, have difficulties with the authorities. So, these camps are in a pretty sorry state.
Yeah, this camp had 45,000 people, and because of an attack on the ICRC and also on the Spanish Red Cross in December, where one of the Spanish women was herself subject to an attempted rape, and then after that, all the NGOs pulled out. The only remaining foreigners are 2 Kenyans working for International Rescue Committee, and a couple other Sudanese employees of some of the groups, and the groups are still working, but on a very reduced level. So when we showed up, we were like the first foreigners they'd seen in more than a month, and it was a big event in the camp, and the sheikhs of the camp, all the various leaders, of whom there were 56. Wanted to see us, and of course it was interesting to see them, and we sat down with them, and all 56 basically wanted to tell us their stories and what they'd been through. It ended up going on for quite a few hours and was fairly repetitious, but I felt like we just had to sit there and listen to all of it because there's nobody else for them to really tell their stories to.
Yeah. More African Union base. Soldiers going out early in the morning on patrol. As you can see from a lot of these pictures, the things that are going on in Darfur that concern us all are happening very much out of reach. You can't go and photograph villages being attacked, women being raped, any of these things. Obviously, it's well, not obviously. In some places you can, but here it's almost impossible. And the African Union have difficulties getting to these places themselves. So a lot of what you're trying to do, or I'm trying to do as a photographer, is just create a sort of sense of what's going on, because you're really grabbing moments. You can't really get your teeth into anything tangible. When we left, Khartoum, back down to El Fasher, we flew over some villages which had been burned and abandoned. So I don't know how well you can see that on the screen, but these are some of those villages. And just to give you a sense of some of the terrain.
Can you back up a second?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to give a little more context to the picture. These are, maybe it's obvious. I'm not sure it is though. These are all family compounds, and the lines that you see are fences made mostly of brush and sticks and bits of wood, and then usually in the center there's a cylindrical shaped grass hut. Sometimes made of mud bricks, but often just of grass and reeds. And this is a pretty small village because each of those enclosures is one family. But it's pretty typical of the typical African villages in Darfur. And along a watercourse, which is most of the year dry, like most of Darfur, they do have a rainy season for about 2 or 3 months. And the rest of the year, they irrigate their crops from deep wells and sometimes from cisterns. And this village, I mean, normally, even from this, we weren't really that high. You would normally see a few battered vehicles and a lot of livestock and people. And you can see in this, even in this picture, that there is just nobody and nothing in this village. And when you fly over the landscape, you just see, actually, I take that back, there are a few animals up there on the left. But I suspect that those are probably, a herd of animals that are being marshaled by some of the Janjaweed in the area, and not from this village. But you just fly over the landscape and you see one village after another like this, and it's rare that you see one that's really peopled any longer.
So this is Darfur is huge, so obviously the landscape changes. But up in the north, it's very much like this, very barren and immense, really, very beautiful as well. This is the Antonov flying over, completely out of focus, and had to run into my room to get the camera. But the government sort of have these homemade bombs which they throw out the back of these planes onto the villages or close to the villages, and it's not really precision bombing, but it does terrorize the locals, which is really the main function. I don't know if you...
Yeah, while we were there, in fact, there were the unit of South African troops that we were with actually was able to go to a scene of a bombing and confirm that, in fact, a bombing had taken place, something the government has denied right along. Typically, only some livestock were killed, and typically the bombs seem to miss everyone, and they're kind of part of one of the things about the Sudanese army is that it's almost completely incompetent and has never actually won an engagement with any of the Darfur rebels. And that's one of the reasons behind this whole policy of arming and equipping paramilitaries like the Janjaweed. They put them to work attacking civilians in the villages and thereby, of course, destroying the base that the rebels rely on. And it's a fairly effective policy, although one completely without any sense of right or wrong.
And that plane is painted white, of course, like the UN aircraft. The UN used similar planes, so I believe, Anthony, that's a crime of war, right? So, they're disguising their own aircraft as United Nations aircraft, so when these things arrive, people aren't expecting them. Or sometimes when the African Union arrive, the people are too afraid to come to the African Union because they're in the same colored helicopters and aircraft. This was a very moving scene here. We're down in Greda now, which is much further south than Al Fasher. And this is a camp, I think, Rod, the last food was given, 5 or 6 weeks before we arrived?
December 8th, I think it was, but quite a long time before we arrived. Although they're actually not in terrible shape yet. This was around, I guess, January 20th or so when we got there. But the World Food Program had taken the precaution, its last feeding, of giving extra rations. So they had actually more like 6 or 8 weeks rations instead of the normal 1 month rations, because they saw problems developing that would force all the NGOs out. And in fact, there was a horrendous attack later in December in which at least two foreign NGO workers were raped or sexually assaulted, and a lot of others were robbed and brutalized. And they all pulled out, and now there's just a few Sudanese employees of these groups working there. Although that's one that can't really be laid at the door of the government in this case, it appears to be Mini Manawi's group of SLA, a rebel group that was responsible. So we arrived at the airport, and these people had a little demonstration to ask for the international community to come back. But Mini Manawi's group, which has made peace with the government, has refused to take any responsibility for what happened or to do anything to try to arrest the perpetrators, which they could quite easily do. And so far the international community has refused to go back to this camp, which has 130,000 people, not yet in dire condition, but probably pretty soon will be.
It's just gratuitous use of a shadow. This lady, Rod, can you remember what happened to this lady? Wasn't this as a result of childbirth?
No, she has a heart condition. She does have a baby, which is on the bed on the right. She's actually not on the floor out of neglect, but because it's more comfortable than the bed, and she preferred to lie there. But she has a serious heart condition, and some of her other children are in the ICRC camp there, being cared for chronic malnutrition problems. But her problem is just medical. This is the hospital in Khartoum with 20-some beds and one Sudanese doctor who works part-time there.
It's in the ICRC hospital. It's malnourished children who have been put on a feeding program, and they get routinely weighed.
Yeah, the ICRC hospital has a doctor and several other medical personnel, and it's a grass huts and bamboo buildings and dirt floor, but it's 1,000 times better than the local hospital. But and this is in a camp of 130,000 people. It's the only real medical facility, and ICRC has a total of 10 staff doing that, as well as providing whatever other services they can in this camp, because there are almost no other humanitarian agencies working at all.
And Rod and I were particularly moved by this young boy who has terrible problems, which basically come from something that would easily be treated. Rod, do you remember this boy? And his name was Muhammad. Was this Muhammad?
Is that
this little boy who had the?
That's yeah. I didn't recognize him in that picture. Yeah. Yeah, his name is Muhammad, and he's going to die. And he has basically from complications from severe malnutrition. He was kwashiorkor when he came, and the consequence of that was complete renal failure. And short of having dialysis for the rest of his life or kidney transplant, which is not feasible in that area, he has a pretty limited prognosis. And what was very touching about this boy, you see behind him this ball, and there's also a toy truck there. He's a really lively kid and very, very talkative. He even has a few words of English. He's only 4 years old, and he was before he had this attack, when he was crying and all. He was extremely lively and chatting away with everybody and just making everybody kind of peal with laughter. And you usually think of kids in this kind of extremis as being kind of unreactive and unresponsive, and he was so full of life and energy, it just sort of drove home the sad outcome that awaits him and his family.
These are the SLA guerrillas, Minamanawi's guys who we met. So this is I don't know whether these men, obviously, but these were the organization responsible for the rape of the NGOs. And that's the lot. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer.
I'm just curious, how come it's all black and white, and why? I mean, what do you think this effect would be the effect for people, especially inside?
Most of the work that I've done is in black and white, so it's sort of how I think, and sort of that's it really. It's I think for me it's the way I like to take pictures, so that's just what I do. This is all digital because you can't ship film out of Darfur, so it's all converted into black and white. But most of what I've done in my career is black and white. It could be in color. No.
Thanks. Thank you for providing that sort of background and the story. I've just come back from South Darfur yesterday, I was in Gareda on December the 18th when the attack happened, and I think it's important to highlight that, although you talked a lot, because you were in Al-Fasher, you talked a lot about the government and the Janjaweed, that it is increasingly right now the fractionalization of the SLA that's creating the impossible situation where NGOs can't provide humanitarian assistance. The rape and the beating and the shooting at the expatriates in Gareda was one thing, but what they were after were the 15 vehicles, the Thuraya phones, the laptops, the Arbigan email. And we can't send our people out into the field for fear of losing the assets, basically, apart from the actual violence, which is now increasing as well. And it's not just the government. It is the government, definitely, and it is definitely the Janjaweed, but it's also the SLA. And I think it's important to recognize that. And I think increasingly we're going to see pressure on the NGOs to go back, but what we need to do is to put the pressure back on all of the different militant factions to provide the security for us to do that.
Yeah, but I think it's also... and that's very true, and we heard a lot about that as well. But it's also the case, I think, that this fractionalization of the rebel groups and the opposition is something the government has adroitly managed and encouraged, and it really plays into their hands. And Mini Malawi, especially in this group, have just done a tremendous service to the government cause, and their behavior since then.
Thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Hussein. I myself from Darfur. Actually, would like to commend the work which has been done by you and by all the Western journalists. Actually, the war in Darfur meant to be a secret war. That's what the regime intended in the first place. And also, they have been saying that because of people of Darfur are 100% are Muslims, so Western are not going to give them any kind of attention like this South or something. But actually, they proved to be wrong, and actually we appreciate that very much. The thing is, there is tremendous kind of information coming from Darfur, and I think the journalists they have done a lot. But actually, in the aspect of the decision making here in the Western countries, actually. Till now, there is no any precise and very practical kind of action to prevent all this kind of atrocities which you have already, photographed here in terms of genocide, in terms of war crimes or something like that. Till now, there is diplomatic kind of action by the Western countries, but there is nothing in terms of no-fly zone, in terms of any kind of intervention, in terms of any kind of pressure on the government of Sudan. There is nothing has been done till now, and till now I think the crimes are continue on the ground. Regarding the Malawi, actually the government of Sudan, just like they have done in southern Sudan, they want to divide actually the Sazarans, they want to divide also the people of Darfur, and they want to use these divisions in order to impose the only solution they have. They don't believe that this political problem has to be resolved through political means. They believe that this has to be resolved by security and military solution. And I think that you will find that very clear when we were in Darfur. Now, after the DPA, post-DPA, the government, they tried to use him actually to fight the non-signatories. That's what they have done in southern Sudan. But actually, because all of his forces, all of his people joined the non-signatories very clearly. It's very clear because that agreement wasn't a negotiated document. It is just imposed on the parties, on Mini Malawi and the government of Sudan, and actually hasn't addressed the root cause of the conflict. The thing is which we want to focus on is how we can push forward so that the key players internationally can put pressure and they can take practical action right now to stop genocide and to prevent the crimes which is going on right now in Darfur. African Union actually has so many problems. It's a very young organization. They don't have any logistics. They don't have any financial support, as well as they don't have mandate. Actually, they don't have mandate to protect our people in the IDP camps. They don't have mandate to protect the civilians at all. Until now, we don't have any kind of strong forces with strong mandate so that the crimes could be prevented. So the focus should be for all those who want justice in Darfur or freedom of Darfur to prevent the crimes in Darfur, actually to be focused on how best we can push forward for a practical solution and practical measures so that we can stop this war and these crimes which are committed in Darfur. Thank you.
Well, I mean, actually, the African Union does have a mandate to protect the IDPs and the camps, a very explicit one. the problem is they don't have the means to do that. I mean, they have a lot of restrictions placed on them, such as not being able to go out at night, and they're also their rules of engagement are very strict, to the point where it's very difficult for them to actually shoot anybody under any circumstances except in utter self-defense. But even all that said, I think they have done remarkably a much better job than I expected to find, and I think that most people appreciate. Their very presence has had some sort of effect on keeping the level of violence against the refugees down somewhat. I mean, these camps are so undefended that you could imagine Janjaweed just going in and slaughtering people, in huge numbers, and that hasn't happened. And I think partly the African Union presence has helped do that. But the organization is under a lot of pressure, and just to be able to continue maintaining the number of soldiers it has. And now they have this hybrid force where UN troops are going to go in, or UN experts and so on are going to reinforce it, but it's really doubtful how well that's going to work. And all of that has just kind of delayed taking any more substantive action by the international community. The U.S. now has kind of thrown its weight behind the idea of the hybrid force, and most recently Nazio, the U.S. envoy, said there's a plan B, but he won't say what that is. But all this has kind of just dragged on since 2004, when the international community got engaged in a big way, and things have just gotten worse kind of steadily, and there's really no end in sight. In a way, you kind of have to take your hat off to the Sudanese, and I'm always impressed in places like this at how intelligent the people that run fairly small countries in horrible places, how intelligently they deal with great powers in conflicts like this, and how well they play the international community and drag everything out, and they've done an adroit job of that, and kept pretty much had their way with Darfur for years after the international community started paying a lot of attention to it.
One thing about the African Union. There are supposed to be 7,000 African Union troops in Darfur. We were told that there are actually 5,300. They're allowed to have 7,000, but there are 5,300, many of whom, of course, are cooks, engineers, drivers. So the number of soldiers, fighting soldiers, is obviously much smaller. It's an area the size of France, right? So let's say with maybe 4,000 armed guys, it's an area the size of France. Villages, down dirt roads, it can take you 3-4 hours to travel 90 kilometers. And the minimum force, one of the military officers we spoke to there thought that they needed was 15,000 as a minimum force. So, these guys are on a hiding to nothing, and they feel the frustration. There's no question about it.
Actually, to correct your figures a little bit, sorry. But
that's what you're there for.
They're allowed to have 8,000 troops. They claim to have 7,000, and they actually only have about 5,300, something like that.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's essential for the survival of 1 or 2 million people to be able to survive in camps that NGOs and international organizations are able to restart their activities. What are the steps that are being taken to ensure that this is made possible? I don't know, I guess there might be like UN facilitated kind of negotiations.
Well, I mean, there are lots of meetings going on between various envoys from the African Union, the United Nations, and from European countries, the EU, and diplomats. And if you judge by the way this has worked in the past, there'll be this flurry of meetings and lots of pressure on the Sudanese government, and eventually, they'll agree to allow, well, they already have agreed, but they'll actually allow some access, and they'll give some guarantees, and some of the parties will give guarantees, and months will go by, and maybe they'll start getting staffed up again, but, we'll see ourselves in 2008 with the situation pretty much the way it is. And I think it's all, very much plays into the government's policy of just sort of playing rope-a-dope with the international community.
Can I just ask, did you go in openly as journalists, and if so, did you have a minder with you most of the time?
we were openly as journalists. It's very difficult to sneak in now because the rebel groups have become so splintered that it's quite hard to move with them. That's why I'm so impressed by this guy from the Telegraph who's been moving around, with them. It's amazing to be able to do that, and very dangerous and difficult. We did get permission, and we had a permit from the Sudanese government that allowed us to go in. We did not go in with a minder, and but you have to, everywhere you go in Darfur, you have to report to the HAC, what's it stand for? Humanitarian Affairs? Humanitarian Aid Commission, which technically is the organization that runs humanitarian aid for Darfur, a Sudanese government organization, but basically it's an arm of the secret police and controls everybody's movements, particularly the NGOs' movements, but also journalists. So we were supposed to report to them all the time, and we did that as little as we could get away with, and try to move around them. It's not like most of the people we were dealing with were not going to turn us into the authorities, so it was actually fairly easy to do that, at least for the limited time that we were there. This lady in the front's been trying to get a microphone. Sorry.
Thanks. In regard to the 6 o'clock cutoff point, 6 p.m., I hope you'll highlight that in Newsweek, because I've never heard of an army that has to quit at 6 p.m.
In fact, in that one picture Gary had of the soldiers marshaling in the darkness, that was actually 7:30 in the morning, because the sun comes up quite late in Darfur this time of year, and they were actually waiting for the sun to come up before they went out.
But my real question is about the origin of this. When I've tried to find out when this trouble started, the answer is usually that the southern, there was the southern rebels, and that it spread to Darfur. But looking to the future, do you think this will eventually be looked on as one of the first climate change sort of wars? Because I do not understand what the Sudanese government is trying to do. There are ethnic differences in other African countries, religious differences, Nigeria, and so on. The ground that Gary showed us is so desolate, there are hardly any trees left. Who would want this land? It's not fertile anyway, even in peacetime, is it? So is this a climate-driven thing that started roughly in the year 2000 and then got noticed by the international community and is likely to threaten the rest of Africa? Or could you think it could be classified as an ethnic religious struggle for land?
Well, a bit of both, really. Not religious, because there are Muslims on both sides in Darfur. And it's not something that spread from southern Sudan, which is a Christian-Muslim conflict. But it did that certainly had an effect on what happened. But in broad strokes, what's happened is advancing desertification, possibly from climate change, but it's happening all across that belt of sub-Saharan Africa, which has driven nomads who tend to be Arabs into competition with pastoralists who tend to be Africans from tribal groups. And in that conflict, the government of Sudan, which is an Arab government, took the side of the Arabs. And then what? But this has been going on not since 2000, but going on really for the last 20, 30 years, maybe more. I'm not an expert on that history, but it's been going on for a long time. And then what happened to complicate things was the southern Sudanese got what in some ways appears to be a very successful peace agreement with the government, where at least on paper they share the oil revenues of the country and so forth. That inspired some of the rebel groups in Darfur, who were also very unhappy about the government siding with the nomads and with their land being taken away, and their people with the conflicts between these nomadic, the nomads versus the farmers. And that inspired them to take up arms against the government. And then the government, which is just astonishingly incompetent militarily and has always been, came across the solution of arming paramilitaries, the Arab nomads, and then things kind of got out of control. But what's inexplicable in all this is how this, if you accept that governments of modernizing the country and joining the international community is just inexplicable. And I just, that's the thing that mystifies me most about the whole thing. It does not seem to serve their interests.
You mentioned oil revenues. How important are the oil revenues in fueling this conflict?
I don't know the full answer to that, but certainly the fact that there is oil and there's oil to share has been a part of the inspiration for some of the rebel groups. There was a lot of oil revenue to share in the south. Darfur is in the north, and when they divvy up the oil resources, the oil resources that are in the north, including in Darfur, will go to the government in Khartoum, and those south of that will go to the southern leaders. And there are some reports of oil in Darfur and on the edges of Darfur, and there are actually Chinese companies prospecting south of Gareda and the far south of Darfur. And there are reports that actually some of the refugees or internally displaced people arriving in Gareda camp especially have been driven out of oil prospecting areas as a deliberate policy to prevent them from seeing what sort of oil activities are going on there. But there are lots of rumors along those lines, but just how solid that is, I don't know. But certainly underlying it is the fact that there's a lot of money around in Sudan.
Yeah. My name is Yahya Bashir. I am from Darfur and used to live in the Kalma camps in Niala. Basically, Darfur means land of the 4 tribes, and it lies in the western Sudan. Its population about 6.5 million, and there are many indigenous African tribes with the Arab tribes. It participates in 35% in the Sudanese economy. According to the political problems, we in Darfur, we didn't have any ethnic dimensions. All the Darfurians, they are Muslims. But in terms of political problems, it started since 1934 when the graduate conference, and we didn't have access to the power. And even when we came to the independence to elect our MPs, we didn't have access to elect our MPs. They imported MPs from Khartoum to elect it in Darfur, and when they became a prime minister, he didn't see Darfur, and he elected in the Darfur area, which is the name is Abdullah Khalil. Our political struggle is started since 1955 during the Red Fusions, Sulu Front, and also Bolat movement in 1991, and also now in armed resistance groups, SLA and JIM and other resistance groups. I want to comment in terms of the human rights violations. There is massive human rights violations in Darfur. It is completely genocide. The one is not learning from the past, not learning from the Holocaust, not learning from Rwanda, not learning from Bosnia. Never happened again, and it is happening, and it is going on daily basis. The way out from this, there is practical things happening here in Europe during the Bosnia's problems. People show the way out and not to act without mandate from the United Nations and solve the problems. While now the international community not acted in Darfur, and if you not show the way out, this means that mass murders and completely genocide, and it is going on. I want to comment why the international community is still now not want to act in Darfur. Thank you.
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons why they don't want to act in Darfur, but the United States certainly doesn't want to get engaged in another conflict in an Arab country. They have their hands full with Iraq, and I think that underlines, the reluctance. Particularly, there's also a big problem with the Security Council, because to get any kind of strong action through, they have to overcome the objections of China, which has enormous business and oil interests in Sudan, and there's very little likelihood that China would not veto any robust action on the part of the Security Council. There are a lot of reasons like that are pretty self-evident. I don't think it's for lack of international concern. There's actually been a very impressive degree of international concern, just in almost every country in the civilized world. Although I have to say that not in Arab countries, who just generally tend to shrug off Darfur as something that the West is worried about, but they shouldn't be. But that's their brother Arabs.
Yeah, I lived in Darfur 1981 in Zalingi for a year and a half, and one of the things that struck me then was just how neglected Darfur was and always has been, ever since the British were involved there back in and they actually killed Ali Dinar, who was Sultan in 1917, I think. But one of the things that struck me is that, if you want to understand more about the history of why the conflict has arisen, I'd really recommend a book, A History of a Short War by Julie Flint and Alex Duval. Is absolutely brilliant in describing where it's come from. I think also I want to just ask about it is often portrayed as African against Arab, and yet, as I understand it, the Janjaweed are not all of the Arab tribes, not all of the Arabs in Darfur. In the south of Darfur, there's a very large tribe called the Rezaigat, who are cattle nomads, and for a long time they refused to join in with the Janjaweed against real pressure from the government. A few months ago, Julie Flint wrote about, because nomads, I remember seeing nomads, and they were the poorest of the poor, talking about at the moment there being large numbers of nomads who are not Janjaweed, but have nowhere to go because they can't go to the camps, because they would be seen as Janjaweed, and are actually, suffering, if you like, as much as anybody else there. And I just wonder whether you came across that at all. And the final point is, traditionally in Darfur, tribal differences, which have always flared up, were resolved by tribal leaders and long-standing local methods of negotiation. That disappeared in the 90s, and yet I personally still think that in the long run is the only real solution in Darfur, rather than an externally brought in solution. I just wonder whether there is any resonance at all for that idea in Darfur today.
It's a very complicated picture, Darfur, and we do tend to depict it in much simpler terms. But there are Arab tribes that are farmers, for that matter, in some parts of Darfur, and not all of them are Janjaweed. And traditionally, the word Janjaweed is a term for Chadian brigands who raided into Darfur. But it's come to mean Arab nomads, and for the most part, the nomad community has thrown its lot in with the government. And I think that's broadly true across Darfur. In every part of Darfur, you have the Janjaweed phenomenon, as we know it, although there are lots of exceptions. I don't know what the solution in Darfur is, but we did witness one of the most interesting things we saw actually was a negotiation that was arranged between some Arab nomads, not armed ones, but they had the other members of their tribe were armed Janjaweed, and the indigenous people in the Greta area, and it was a negotiation it was actually the third or fourth in a series of meetings that they had to discuss various issues between people in the camps and the nomads living in the area around it. And they actually were able to talk to each other, and they did, in a very impressive way. They started out, the Africans started out by saying that they wouldn't discuss anything because the Janjaweed, the armed ones, their representatives had not showed up at the meeting. And then they agreed not to discuss this, not to have a discussion, and they went on discussing this discussion that they were not having for about the next 5 hours. And out of that, I mean, they actually had made a little bit of progress and agreed on some things and aired their grievances, and it was a really impressive process, and it did give you some hope for that happening in a small way, even though there were some really kind of shocking characteristics. One of the issues on the side of the people in the camps was 2 women who had gone out looking for firewood and had been not only raped but also dismembered and killed and then left with a baby on the ground, left to die, although somebody found the baby before it died. And they wanted the perpetrators of that turned in by the nomads who were operating in that same area. And it's pretty clear to everybody they would know who they were in that area. And the Arab response was, yes, but, we've lost a cow and a horse, and we want the perpetrators of those thefts brought to justice, and you haven't done that. And they really kind of equated the two, and it was pretty shocking. The other thing about such negotiations is that when they take place, and in this case they were being mediated by African civilian police monitors, when they take place without any outside influence, they can be very effective. But when you have the government trying to manipulate the process and arming one faction or encouraging one faction to act against the others, it doesn't seem to be very hopeful at all. I mean, you need goodwill on the side of the government, particularly in this case, and I think that goodwill is really lacking.
Hello, my name is Mario Raceto. I'm a student of photojournalist and documentary photography in LCC. I'm here as part of my class, and I have to say that today is my friend Claudia. It's her birthday, so it's part of the celebration being here.
Happy birthday, Claudia.
It's great to be here, and well, my question is for you, Gary. I've been listening and seeing your images, and I want to know, how do you manage to be in the front line with all this suffering and all this extreme situation? How did it affect you emotionally, and how can you work with this? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a question that I get asked a lot. I'm sure Rod gets asked a lot as well. It's a good question. It's a very difficult question to answer, but I'll answer it this way. When you do this for a job, if you're at the beginning of a career, you have to subjugate your own needs to the need of the job, right? You're out there trying to tell a story, trying to change the world, trying to leave it a better place than you found it, and that's what's important. So how you feel is not important at all. So you will deal with it however you find best. And for me, I work with Rod. I've worked with Rod, I think, probably for 14 years. So if we're traveling together, he's a good friend, and we talk, and I just deal with it that way. And some of it I carry with me. But it's not important, I think, is what I'm telling you. And happy birthday.
There's been a lot of debate about whether what's going on in Darfur is technically genocide or not. And in that regard, a lot of people draw a comparison with Rwanda. And on one hand, you have a very arid legal debate about whether it technically falls within, say, the Genocide Convention. On the other hand, for example, I was in Nyara about a year ago. I remember going into Kalma camp, and people there saying, well, at that time they thought the AU contingent in Nyala was about to be withdrawn, and people saying, we are about to all be slaughtered, it's just like Rwanda, and none of you are doing anything. So my question is, number one, do you think it's right to draw a comparison with Rwanda and to call it genocide? And number two, do you think it even matters at the end of the day?
I'm not sure about number two, but it's really a hard question to answer. I mean, I put that question to the deputy force commander of the African Union in El Fasher, who's a Rwandan brigadier, and his feeling is that it was not a genocide, that it didn't rise to the level of the kind of things that happened in Rwanda, and he's right in that sense. I mean, they haven't been massacring huge numbers of people in an attempt to exterminate the entire population. On the other hand, from a legal point of view, I mean, what ethnic cleansing in Bosnia was defined as a form of genocide, and so in that sense, certainly what's going on is genocide. I mean, it's a terrible violence against the people because of their ethnic makeup and so on, and whatever you call it, it's pretty bad, and it certainly is in the long run, or even maybe not that long a run, going to wipe out a way of life. Whether it doesn't seem at this point that the goal is to exterminate those people, but certainly to destroy their way of life in a deliberate way. Whatever we call it, I think there are probably quite a few people in Sudan who one day or another will face justice in some international tribunal for war crimes.
We have Anthony Dworkin here from the Crimes of War organization. Anthony, do you want to say something about that in legal terms?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Actually, that fits into the question I was going to ask anyway. I mean, I think, you're right. The thing about genocide is it has this reputation as being kind of the crime of crimes. It's on a different level. And genocide is a very special case because it has this intent requirement. It has to be you have to be trying to eradicate a particular group, ethnic, racial, religious, a tribal group, in whole or in part. So you can commit very grave crimes without them rising to the level of genocide. And, international scholars have divided. The United States has said it is genocide, and then there was the International Commission headed by Antonio Cassese, who's a very prominent Italian lawyer, who said, no, it wasn't. But, clearly what's happening there represents crimes against humanity, which is a very grave crime under international law. So whether it's technically genocide or not, there's no doubt that, these are very grave international crimes. And, of course, the International Criminal Court now has jurisdiction and has mounted an investigation. And I was actually wondering whether you encountered in your work there any evidence that people were aware of what the International Court was doing, that any of the victims or people in the camps had any hope, whether justice was an important aspiration to them, whether you thought that it was having any impact or any resonance on the ground.
I think there are a lot of Sudanese officials who are very worried about the possibility that they'll be hauled before the tribunal one day. And you did hear people talk about that, about the possibility that would happen. It is something very much on people's minds in Darfur and in Khartoum as well.
Do you think that I've also heard it said that that's one reason why they don't want to let the UN in, because a UN force might come under pressure to arrest people and ship them off to the tribunal?
I don't doubt it, and I think Bashir himself has a great deal to worry about. I mean, he famously remarked in an early meeting when the rebel movements were just starting off in Darfur and just starting to become a problem, I guess, in 2003. He had a meeting with his commanders in Darfur, and they were proposing some sort of a reconciliation or some sort of negotiations with the rebels, and he dismissed that out of hand, and he said your instructions are to go out and take no prisoners and leave no wounded. And that alone would be enough to haul him before, if he really said that. It's not, some people say that's just apocryphal, that he wouldn't be that stupid. But on the other hand, he's done some pretty stupid things. And if he did in fact say that, I would think that that'd be enough to make a case against him.
My name is Zaid. I'm a student from City University. I want to ask you, are you going back to Darfur again to...
I doubt I'll ever get a visa to Sudan again, but I'll try.
I mean, there is still some places that you need to, what does it take to draw the attention of the international community to what is happening in Darfur? Does it have to be like a genocide, and they have to wait until it's a genocide in order to act against it?
I think there's a lot of information about Darfur out there, actually. I mean, you've got people like George Clooney going there, you've got Hilary Benn here, you've got some fairly high-profile people going out to Darfur and talking about it, and very little has been done. I think the media pays probably more attention to Darfur than it pays to Congo, where more people are being killed and have been killed. So I don't think it's for a lack of information. It's just a lack of political will. It's my personal belief.
Gary, how has your photo essay been received internationally?
Good question. Very disappointing, actually. In fact, I had an extraordinary conversation with Nick, who runs the 7 office in Paris, who told me that he spoke to a couple of magazines in Europe who said, we ran something a little over a year ago, so we're not interested in running anything at the moment. And then we had a Swiss magazine who said, nothing unusual, that it was too depressing. But they've actually now said, well, can you go back next week? But it took us, I think, 6 months to get the visa and 3 months to get into Darfur, and they want to send their correspondent now. But the sales of this have been very disappointing, and that's not disappointing financially. It's disappointing because people are not running the pictures. So we've got them out on the Amnesty website. I think MSF are running them, and they move. People see them, but the conventional media are not particularly interested in running this story. And it's a miracle, really, that Newsweek ran this story. I mean, it's fantastic that they did, and the attention they paid to Africa in the last 3 or 4 months is extraordinary. But it's very rare to get these kinds of stories any good space in the Western media. Very rare. I'm sure it's the same for you with the Independent. But it's a tragedy. But one of the wonderful means of communication we now have as photographers is the agency websites. So, I can move these pictures onto the 7 website, and they're available for people to see, and MSF, Amnesty, all these organizations. So the work does get seen. But there you are, sort of preaching to the converted, somewhat. But yeah, very disappointing.
In terms of the aid situation, obviously things have been deteriorating over the last few months in terms of attacks on aid workers and so on, and lots of the foreign staff have had to pull out. But on the other hand, our colleague at the front said that she thought there would be pressure on aid workers to go back in. I was just wondering, how bad do you think things have to get before there will be that pressure for conditions to be improved so that aid workers can return? And how long do you think it might be before we see an improvement in humanitarian access?
Well, I mean, maybe you could chip in if you want, but I think that the so far the situation has not gotten really dire. It's more or less under control. People are not starving in the camps, and it could be a whole lot worse. And I think as it gets worse, that pressure will go up. But there's less than, they're not letting people in to see what's going on, and they're putting an awful lot of pressure on the humanitarian workers who are there not to talk about it. 95% of the aid workers that we interviewed didn't want to be quoted by name, which is something I've never experienced in any other country, in any other crisis. Usually they're the one group of people you can go to freely and talk to openly about anything. And that's just how intense the pressure is. I mean, they're all, of course, concerned about getting thrown out or even being attacked in some cases. And they want to keep trying to do what job they can do with the limited access that they do have. I think if the humanitarian situation gets dramatically worse, there'll be dramatically more pressure. But the way it is now, it could limp along like this for quite some time.